Story number 1. The Watcher in the Sky. It was meant to be a weekend getaway, a chance to escape the chaos of the city and reconnect with nature. A group of 5 friends, familiar with each other's quirks and comforts, had decided on a camping trip in the desolate forests of Appalachia. The promise of silence, the smell of pine trees, and the whispers of a forgotten world surrounded them as they set up their tents by a small creek. The first night passed without incident. A gentle breeze whispered through the trees. The crackling of their campfire provided warmth, and stories about their college days floated into the air, light and carefree. But that peace was short-lived. Around midnight, a rustling sound stirred them from their sleep. At first, they thought it was an animal, perhaps a deer or a raccoon, but the noise was too deliberate, too persistent. It circled the camp, moving just beyond the reach of their flashlight beams. Nervous laughter rippled through the group, but the tension in the air was palpable. No one went out to check. Probably just the wind, Jared said, though his voice trembled with uncertainty. They tried to brush it off, but no one could ignore the growing unease that wrapped itself around them. The wind picked up, and the rustling grew louder. The sounds weren't natural, like footsteps, or worse, something watching them. By dawn, the noise had stopped, but the unease lingered. On the second night, things took a darker turn. They'd barely settled into their tents when a scream shattered the quiet. They rushed out, hearts racing, to find that Casey, one of the girls in the group, was missing. Her tent lay empty, her belongings undisturbed. Panic set in. She must have gone for a walk, Sarah said, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her doubt, but it didn't make sense. Casey wouldn't have wandered off alone at night. They searched the area for hours, calling her name, but there was no sign of her. That's when they saw it. A shadow. A dark silhouette against the backdrop of the ridge far in the distance. It was tall, unnaturally so, and seemed to stretch into the air in ways that didn't make sense. For a moment, none of them spoke. The shape was no bird, no animal, but something far more unnerving. "What the hell is that?" Mike whispered. As they stood frozen, staring at the figure, it shifted, and they saw an unmistakable pair of wings, large and black, stretching far beyond the creature's body. It was like nothing they had ever seen before. Then, as if aware of their gaze, the figure began to move, retreating into the night. The group huddled together, frightened and unsure. Was it just their minds playing tricks, or had they truly witnessed something impossible? Over the next hours, they found nothing of Casey, no sign of her presence anywhere. The group, desperate, finally turned to the one thing they hoped they wouldn't need to: the old stories. As they gathered around the campfire, huddling in the safety of the flickering flame, they found a pamphlet left behind by the park rangers, hidden in a drawer of the old log cabin they had rented. It spoke of sightings, long-standing rumors of a dark, winged creature known as the Mothman, a harbinger of doom. People in the area spoke of the creature's appearance before unspeakable tragedies. Each event tied to it was more devastating than the last. Their blood ran cold when they read the final sentence: "It has never left." The night passed in agonizing silence, the wind now carrying an oppressive weight. And though they made plans to leave at first light, none of them slept. But when the sun rose, there was something new in the air, something darker. They knew then that their friend was gone. Casey was lost to them forever, and they would never escape the horror of what they had witnessed. As they packed up their things, each of them turned toward the ridge one last time. There, standing tall, dark, and watching, was the figure, the Mothman, unblinking, waiting. And just before they fled, they understood. The creature had been there all along, watching them. They had been its next tragedy. The Watcher in the sky had marked them. It was too late now. Story number 2. The Mothman Prophecy. Lena had never been a believer in signs, or omens, or anything that tried to whisper secrets into the dark corners of your mind. But then she lost Adam. And after the funeral, the walls of her life began to crumble. Grief didn't just settle in her heart. It wrapped around her like an iron weight, suffocating her every breath. It had been 6 months since Adam's sudden death. 6 months since that night, since the crash. Lena had been left with questions she couldn't ask, a void she couldn't fill. No answers, no explanations, just the endless ache of his absence. And that's when she made the decision. She would leave. Leave the apartment, leave the memories, and leave the city that held nothing but the echoes of a life now gone. She ended up in Point Pleasant, a small town tucked away in the West Virginia hills, where the air felt thinner and the people seemed colder. A place with an unsettling quiet. A place that, according to the locals, was more than just a dot on the map. It was the kind of town where the night had secrets, where the whispers of the past never quite died. The town's history was riddled with rumors. There were stories of a winged creature that appeared before disaster, sightings stretching back to the 1960s. People said it was the Mothman, an entity that hovered at the edge of the world's unraveling. Its wings, they said, were vast and black. Its eyes like burning coals that could see into the very marrow of your bones. The townsfolk didn't talk much. They'd nod politely when Lena asked about it, but there was always a tightness in their voices, as though they'd been burned by something they couldn't forget. The air felt thick with unspoken fears, as though something was waiting for her, waiting for all of them. She moved into a small house on the outskirts of town, a quiet place that had once belonged to an old woman who had passed away years ago. It was modest, unremarkable, perfect for someone like her who didn't want to be noticed. The house creaked with every gust of wind, and at night the moonlight cast long, ghostly shadows on the walls. But it was hers now, and in those first few days it felt like a safe space, a sanctuary from the world she had left behind. But then the dreams started. At first they were faint, a shadow in the corner of her vision, just out of reach, but always there, lurking in the periphery. In the dreams, Adam was there, but different. His eyes were wide and unseeing, and his voice was lost, swallowed by the dark. And the Mothman was there too, standing in the distance, its wings unfurling like a storm on the horizon, its gaze locked on her, as if it was waiting for something, waiting for her. The first time she saw the Mothman in person was a night when the wind howled through the trees, shaking the house like it might be torn apart. She stood by the window, staring out into the darkness, when something caught her eye. A shadow, vast and unnatural, moved against the sky. It wasn't a bird, it wasn't a plane, it was a creature, towering in black, with wings that stretched across the night like a shroud. Lena's heart raced. Her breath caught in her throat. And then it was gone. But she wasn't alone. The whispers began to fill her mind, quiet at first, like a song she couldn't quite remember. She started to feel it, a strange connection to the Mothman. It wasn't fear, not entirely. It was something else, something deeper. Like it knew her, understood her grief in ways she couldn't explain. There was a sense of inevitability about it, as though her husband's death had been the beginning of something much larger, something darker, and she was tied to it in some unfathomable way. Lena tried to ignore it. She tried to go about her days, to live a normal life, but it was impossible. Everywhere she went, she saw it. Out of the corner of her eye, perched on rooftops, watching from the edge of the woods. Each time it appeared, she felt the weight of its presence, the heaviness of its unblinking gaze. It wasn't just the Mothman. It was something more. One night, after weeks of seeing the creature, Lena went to the edge of the woods. Her feet led her, almost without thinking, to a clearing where the air was thick with something ancient and oppressive. The wind died down, and the silence was suffocating. There, standing before her, was the Mothman. It was closer now, its wings unfurled and stretching wide, blocking out the stars. Its eyes gleamed with an unnatural light, and as Lena stared into them, she felt an icy chill run through her. The whispers grew louder, and she understood she was part of this, part of whatever was coming. And it was coming. It had always been coming. The Mothman had not just been watching her, it had been waiting. The world was on the brink of disaster, and Lena was tangled in its unraveling threads. Her grief, her loss, had it all been leading to this moment? Was she the one it had chosen to carry the weight of what was to come? She didn't know, but she couldn't run from it anymore. The Mothman spread its wings and took flight, its silhouette blending with the night sky, and Lena followed. Story number 3. The Eyes in the Dark. Tom had always been a solitary man, the kind of person who found comfort in the hum of his truck's engine and the endless stretch of highway. He was a long-haul truck driver, a life spent on the road, moving from one distant town to the next. There was something peaceful about the routine. The long hours, the empty roads, the loneliness. It suited him, or at least it used to. It all began on one of those long, quiet nights, driving through the empty fields of the Midwest. The moon hung low, casting pale light over the road ahead. The only sounds were the steady rumble of the truck and the occasional crackle of static from the radio. Tom had been driving for hours, his eyes growing heavy, the fatigue settling in when it happened. In his rearview mirror, he saw it, a massive shadow stretching across the darkened road. At first, he thought it was just the shape of a tree or a cloud, but then it moved. It wasn't natural. The wings were too wide, too dark, and the shadow too vast to belong to anything he recognized. He slammed on the brakes, pulling the truck over to the side of the highway. His heart raced as he killed the engine, staring into the night. There was nothing. No shadow, no creature, just the empty, desolate road stretching out behind him. Tom shook his head, trying to dismiss it as nothing more than exhaustion. The world out here could play tricks on the mind, but the strange feeling stayed with him. That night, he barely slept, the unease gnawing at him. Over the next few weeks, the sightings grew more frequent. Each time, it was in the rearview mirror, a flicker of movement, a shadow that shouldn't have been there. Sometimes it looked like a figure, standing far off in the distance, its features impossible to make out. Other times it was closer, an outline too tall and too wide to be anything ordinary. The wings were the most unsettling part, dark and jagged, stretching out behind the figure like something out of a nightmare. Tom tried to shake it off. He told himself it was just his mind playing tricks, the stress of the job, the loneliness creeping in. But every time he looked in that mirror, there it was again, waiting, watching. He started to feel it too, a sense of being followed, as though the presence was always just behind him, lurking in the shadows, never truly gone. The truck's headlights would catch something, a fleeting glimpse of a shape on the horizon, and his pulse would race. Was it the same figure? He couldn't say for sure, but it always seemed to be there, watching. As the weeks passed, Tom's grip on reality began to slip. His sleep became more restless, the images in the rearview mirror growing clearer and more vivid, He started to question whether he was losing his mind. Could this be happening to him, or was he simply cracking under the weight of solitude and exhaustion? One night, the truck's headlights illuminated something he couldn't deny. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, with wings that spread wide across the horizon. It stood just off the side of the road, watching him as he drove past. But this time, it wasn't a fleeting image. He could see the eyes, glowing red, staring directly at him. The eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, everything else seemed to disappear. The road, the truck, the world itself. It was just him and those eyes, burning into him like a fire. Terrified, Tom slammed his foot down on the gas, the truck surging forward, but he could still feel those eyes on him, following, hunting. And every time he looked in the mirror, they were there. Closer, more insistent. He was being stalked, he was sure of it. And it wasn't just some random creature, this thing, this Mothman, was connected to something older, something deeper, something far more dangerous than he could comprehend. The following days blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and fear. Tom tried to outrun it, changing his route, speeding through the night, but it didn't matter. The Mothman was always there, lurking just beyond the headlights, its wings casting a long shadow over him. It was like a curse, a presence he couldn't escape. It was always just behind him, waiting for the moment when he would finally break. One night, as he crossed an old bridge over a river, the truck's headlights flickered and then died. The engine sputtered to a halt, and Tom was left in the dark, surrounded by the sound of the rushing water below and the eerie silence of the night. He tried to start the engine again, but it wouldn't turn over. His pulse quickened as he felt the weight of the air shift, heavy and thick. He turned in his seat, staring out the window. There, standing in the distance on the bridge, was the Mothman. Its wings spread wide, blocking the sky, its glowing eyes staring straight at him. The figure didn't move, didn't blink. It just watched. Tom's heart raced, his breath shallow. He knew it was too late. He wasn't going to outrun it anymore. The Mothman had been waiting for him, following him all this time. It wasn't just a random encounter, it had been stalking him, waiting for this moment. The moment when he would finally understand. With a low, guttural sound, the Mothman spread its wings and began to move toward him, its shadow swallowing him whole. And in that moment, Tom realized the truth. This creature wasn't just a warning. It was the end. The eyes in the dark had finally caught him. Story number 4. The Silent Forest. Maggie Turner had always been drawn to the unknown. As an investigative journalist, she had traveled to the most remote corners of the world in search of stories that others deemed too strange, too dangerous, or too unbelievable. But none of her previous investigations had prepared her for the quiet town of Black Hollow. The town, nestled deep in the Appalachian Hills, had a reputation. It was known for strange sightings, rumors of a creature with glowing red eyes and massive wings. The locals called it the Mothman, a creature that appeared before disasters, a harbinger of doom. Maggie was skeptical, of course. A creature like that was nothing more than a local legend, a story passed down to explain the unexplainable. Or so she thought. She arrived in Black Hollow on a crisp autumn evening, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine. The town was small, too small in fact. It felt like it was frozen in time, the kind of place where nothing ever changed. The people were friendly enough, but there was an unease in their eyes, as though they were afraid of something just beyond the edges of their vision. Maggie spent the first few days interviewing the townsfolk, asking about the Mothman. Most were hesitant to talk, but the stories began to surface. Some swore they had seen it with their own eyes, on the outskirts of town, watching from the trees at night. Others spoke of strange occurrences, livestock gone missing, sudden storms that appeared out of nowhere, and the inexplicable sense of being followed. The more Maggie heard, the more she felt the weight of something unspeakable pressing down on the town. But it wasn't just the stories that unsettled her, it was the dreams. Each night, she would lie in the old guest room of the bed and breakfast, the darkness swallowing the room. And each night she dreamed of the Mothman. It started as a shadow, a silhouette against the moonlit sky, its wings unfurled, stretching wide like a storm cloud. Then the eyes would appear, glowing red, watching her, unblinking, full of hunger. She would wake in a cold sweat, heart pounding. The image of the creature burned into her mind. The dreams grew more vivid, more real. The creature's presence felt closer, as though it was standing just behind her, breathing down her neck. It wasn't long before Maggie began to notice something strange. The townspeople were afraid. They wouldn't say it outright, but every conversation eventually turned to the same warning. Don't go near the forest after dark. The fear in their voices was palpable, their eyes darting nervously to the tree line whenever the subject came up. Maggie was intrigued. There was something about the forest, something that kept the townspeople away. And it was more than just fear of the Mothman. Curiosity gnawed at her. Despite the warnings, despite the dreams, she couldn't let it go. She had to see for herself. So, one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Maggie made her way to the edge of the forest. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their twisted branches reaching out like dark fingers. The forest was thick with shadows, the kind that seemed to move on their own, shifting in the corner of her vision. She took a deep breath and stepped into the woods, the cool air brushing against her skin. Every step she took seemed to echo louder than the last, as though the forest was listening, waiting. The deeper she went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air felt heavier, like it was thick with something unspoken. The silence was unnerving. There were no birds, no insects, no sound at all except for the crunch of fallen leaves beneath her feet. The further she ventured, the more she felt like something was watching her, tracking her every move. And then she heard it, a rustling sound, faint at first, like something moving through the underbrush. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The rustling grew louder, closer. She turned quickly, her heart pounding in her chest, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the shadows stretching between the trees. Maggie's pulse raced as she continued on, unwilling to turn back now. Her mind was filled with questions, each one louder than the last. Was this where it had been happening? Was the Mothman real? And if so, what was it doing here? It wasn't until she reached the clearing that she understood. In the center of the clearing, standing tall and imposing, was the Mothman. Its wings stretched wide, blocking out the moonlight, casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the entire forest. Its eyes gleamed red in the darkness. Two glowing orbs locked on her, pulling her closer. She couldn't move. The air was thick with a sense of dread, an overwhelming pressure on her chest that made it hard to breathe. And then she understood. The Mothman wasn't just a creature. It wasn't some cryptid or supernatural being. It was a manifestation, a living entity born of the forest, the town, and the fear that had festered in the hearts of the people for generations. It fed on that fear, drawing its victims in with each passing night, growing stronger with every ounce of despair it consumed. As the Mothman took a step toward her, its wings fluttering with an unnatural grace, Maggie realized she had made a terrible mistake. The stories were true, the warnings were real, and now she was part of the forest's curse. The Mothman was no legend. It was alive, and it was waiting. Maggie's last breath was lost in the darkness as the creature's wings enveloped her, and the forest fell silent once more. Story number 5. The Last Flight. It was supposed to be a routine flight, just another day in the sky. But something went wrong, something they couldn't have predicted. The small plane, bound for a remote airstrip, dropped like a stone out of the clear blue sky, crashing into the dense forest below. The survivors, half conscious and bloodied, slowly crawled from the wreckage. There were 4 of them. Tom, the pilot, his wife Emily, a businesswoman named Claire, and a young man named Jake. They were shaken, disoriented, and terrified, but they were alive, barely. The crash site was deep in the wilderness, miles from any road, surrounded by towering trees and thick underbrush. Tom tried to start a fire, but his hands shook too badly. Emily looked around, her breath coming in shallow gasps, the terror of the crash still fresh in her mind. It wasn't long before they realized the severity of their situation. The first night was quiet. Too quiet. The forest seemed to breathe with an unnatural stillness, as if something was listening. But the second night, that's when it began. Jake was the first to see it. He was standing at the edge of the wreckage, staring into the dark woods, when he noticed a light, faint but unmistakable. It blinked in the distance, far beyond the trees. At first, he thought it was just the reflection of a plane's lights, but there was no sound, no engines, just the eerie glow. And then, the shape appeared. At first, it was just a shadow, tall, dark, and vast. It flickered in the corner of his vision, something huge moving silently between the trees. His heart skipped a beat as the figure grew clearer. The wings were enormous, black as night, stretching out far beyond what any bird should have. And its eyes, 2 glowing red orbs, pierced the darkness, watching him from the distance. He froze, the sight locking him in place. For a moment, he didn't breathe. The others hadn't seen it yet, but he couldn't take his eyes off the figure in the trees. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but it was there, watching. "Tom," Jake whispered, his voice barely above a breath. "Something's out there." Tom turned, following Jake's gaze into the woods, but saw nothing. "It's just your mind playing tricks," Tom said, though he didn't sound convinced. But Jake wasn't so sure. It wasn't just the figure, it was the feeling. The air felt colder, denser, like something was pushing against them from all sides. The forest wasn't just silent, it was suffocating. The next day, they set out to find their way to civilization, hoping to walk to a road or some sign of life. But the forest seemed endless, stretching on in every direction, twisting and turning in ways that made no sense. They couldn't find their bearings. The trees began to feel more like walls, trapping them in an endless maze. And all the while, the lights kept appearing, far away at first, but always in the distance, always following them. As night fell, the creature's presence grew more pronounced. The lights flared again, much closer this time. They saw it, its massive form standing in the shadows, its wings unfurling as it moved between the trees. The air was thick with something ancient and hungry. Tom tried to keep his composure, but his eyes darted nervously to the dark corners of the forest. He could feel it watching them, tracking their every step, and there was no escape. The creature was fast, impossibly so, and it always seemed to be one step ahead. It was hunting them. The terror began to take hold. Claire collapsed under the weight of it, sobbing uncontrollably. She begged them to leave the forest, to run, but they had nowhere to go. Emily's face was pale, her body trembling as she clung to her husband's side. Jake was distant, his eyes wide and haunted as he glanced over his shoulder, convinced that the creature was getting closer. By the third night, it was no longer just a shadow in the woods. The Mothman, if that was truly what it was, came closer, its presence undeniable. They could hear the sound of its wings now, a soft but unsettling flutter, like the air itself was being torn apart. And the lights, they were everywhere, flickering, hovering just beyond the trees, a warning. The fear they had felt before became something more primal, something they couldn't shake. The Mothman wasn't a harbinger of disaster, it was a predator, and it fed on the fear, the desperation of those it trapped. It was drawing them closer, inch by inch, until it would finally pounce. The creature didn't need to chase them. It didn't need to hunt them down. It simply had to wait. It waited for them to break, to unravel. It fed on the terror that boiled inside of them, the knowledge that they were lost, the realization that there was no escape. As the fourth night approached, they found themselves at the edge of a cliff. They had nowhere to run. The sky was alive with strange lights now, swarming, dancing around them. And from the forest, they could hear the soft rustling of its wings. The Mothman was coming. Tom took one last look at his wife, his friends, and then he turned, facing the darkness. He wasn't sure if it would come for him first, or if it would take them all in the end, but he knew one thing for certain. The creature was real, and it was waiting. The last thing they heard before the Mothman claimed them was the sound of its wings. Story number 6. The Harbinger. James had always been a practical man, grounded by logic and reason. He didn't believe in the supernatural, didn't waste time on stories of things that went bump in the night. But that was before the dream started, before the shadow appeared at the edge of his vision. It began as a flicker, a shadow in the corner of his eye. At first, he dismissed it as his mind playing tricks on him. But then it came more often, always when he was alone, standing tall, dark, and vast against the backdrop of the night. It had wings, huge, black wings that seemed to stretch into the void. The wings were silent, but everything else about the figure was too loud, too oppressive. Its eyes, those red eyes, burned with an unnatural fire. He couldn't understand it. He hadn't been thinking about anything strange, hadn't read any reports or heard any stories that might have triggered such visions. But the shadow was there, night after night, pressing against the edges of his reality. And then one evening, while scrolling through the news, he saw it. Mothman sightings reported near Milltown. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He had heard the legend before, the creature with the dark wings that appeared before disasters, a harbinger of doom. He had always dismissed it as another rural myth, something to scare children and keep people away from the forests. But now, something inside him snapped. James couldn't stop thinking about it. The shadow, the eyes, the reports of strange deaths in Milltown, all happening in the days before something terrible occurred. The more he looked, the more the pieces began to fall into place. There were more sightings than he had realized, stretching back decades. Some people claimed to have seen it perched on rooftops. Others described it as a dark shape watching them from the trees. But every encounter ended the same way, with fear, with death, with something lost that could never be recovered. The obsession consumed him. He read every article, every account he could find. He dug into the history of the creature, searching for any clue that might explain what it was, why it appeared, and what it wanted. But no matter how much he learned, no matter how many reports he pored over, nothing could explain the way the shadow had started to bleed into his own life. It was subtle at first, just a flicker of movement in the dark, a shadow stretching too far across the walls of his apartment. But soon, it was everywhere. The figure would stand in the distance, lurking in alleyways or in the reflection of shop windows, watching him. When he walked to work, he could feel it behind him, like something was just out of sight, waiting to step into his path. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was following him, stalking him in the shadows. And then, one night, as he stood in front of his bathroom mirror, he saw it. The Mothman. It was there, just behind him, its wings outstretched, filling the narrow space between him and the mirror. He turned quickly, but it was gone. Gone, but not gone. He could still feel its presence in the room, a coldness that pressed against his skin, suffocating him. Sleep became impossible. The dreams came harder, faster, until they were no longer dreams at all. He would wake to the sound of wings flapping outside his window, to the soft scrape of something scraping across the walls. He could hear the Mothman's breath, shallow and ragged, just behind him, just close enough to touch. The line between reality and nightmare began to blur. Was the Mothman real, or was it just his mind unraveling? He no longer knew. The more he tried to escape it, the more it seemed to be tied to him, as though the creature was part of him, a reflection of the terror he had locked deep inside. Was it feeding on his fear? Or had it always been there, a shadow in the back of his mind, waiting for the right moment to emerge? James couldn't tell anymore. The shadow followed him everywhere. At work, it was there in the corners of the office, stretching out from the edges of his vision. At home, it crouched in the dark, waiting for him to turn out the lights. And in the silence of the night, when the rest of the world was asleep, he could hear its wings, a soft, fluttering sound, always just out of reach. He stopped going out. He stopped answering calls. He locked the doors and kept the blinds drawn, but it didn't help. The creature was always there, growing stronger, feeding off his fear. The more he tried to escape it, the more it seemed to take over. One night, in a fit of panic, James stood in front of the mirror again, staring into his own eyes. He was trembling, his mind racing, the pressure of the shadow pressing down on him. And in that moment he understood. The Mothman wasn't just a harbinger of doom, it was his doom. It wasn't stalking him from outside. It had always been there, a part of him, waiting to break free. It had been feeding on his fear all along, growing stronger as his sanity unraveled. The creature wasn't just real, it was him, or at least a reflection of everything he had buried deep within himself. The last thing James saw before everything went black were the glowing red eyes of the Mothman, staring back at him from the mirror. And then, nothing. The Mothman had claimed him. Story number 7. The Phantom Visitor. It seemed like a dream come true at first. A big old house, nestled at the edge of a quiet town, just waiting to be filled with the laughter of a new family. The Martins had been looking for a fresh start after moving from the city, and when they found this house, they couldn't resist. It was large, charming, and cheap, too good to pass up. The house had been abandoned for years, but that only made it more intriguing. The walls were thick with dust, and the furniture that remained was old and covered in sheets, but it had potential. Emily and John, along with their 2 children, Alice and Ben, spent the first day cleaning and unpacking. Everything felt normal, almost peaceful. But that first night changed everything. As they settled in, the wind picked up, moaning through the cracks in the walls. The house groaned as if it was waking from a long slumber. Emily was in the kitchen making dinner, while John checked the locks and windows. Alice and Ben had gone to bed early, tired from the long journey. It was when Emily stood by the window, looking out over the yard, that she first saw it. A figure, dark and impossibly large, perched on the roof. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, but as she stared, her heart dropped. The creature was real. Its wings were enormous, stretching wide across the night sky like the canvas of some terrible dream. Its eyes glowed a faint red, piercing through the darkness, fixed directly on her. She stepped back from the window, her breath catching in her throat. The creature didn't move, but it didn't need to. The sheer presence of it made the air feel heavy, suffocating. "John," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "There's something on the roof." John came into the room, but by the time he reached her side, the creature was gone. He scanned the yard, but there was nothing there. "It's probably just an owl or something," he said, trying to reassure her. But Emily didn't feel reassured. She couldn't shake the image of those glowing red eyes. Something about it felt wrong, unnatural. That night, the dream started. Emily woke in a cold sweat, heart pounding, a sense of dread washing over her. The Mothman, she didn't know it was called that yet, but she would soon, was in her dreams too. Perched on the roof, its wings stretched wide, watching her with its burning eyes. But in her dream, it wasn't just watching, it was waiting. And then, in the dark corners of the house, she saw it moving. The Mothman was there, in the hallways, in the rooms, lurking just out of sight. The next day, things began to spiral. Strange occurrences began happening around the house. Doors would creak open on their own, lights flickered without reason, and sometimes they'd hear soft scratching sounds from above, like something dragging its claws across the roof. Every time they looked out the window, they would see it, just for a moment, its silhouette against the sky. At first, they tried to ignore it. John said it was just their imagination, but the longer they stayed, the more impossible it became to pretend. The Mothman wasn't just a shadow, it was real, and it seemed tied to something darker within the house itself. One night, when the wind howled louder than ever, the family gathered in the living room, trying to stay close and keep the feeling of dread at bay. But the atmosphere in the house was oppressive. The walls felt like they were closing in. And then they heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from somewhere above them. John went to check the attic, but the stairs creaked under his weight, as though they hadn't been used in years. When he reached the top, the air was thick and stale. The attic was filled with old furniture and forgotten things. But it wasn't the dust that made his skin crawl. It was the sudden chill in the air, the feeling that something was watching him from the shadows. He turned quickly, convinced he had heard something behind him. But when he looked, the attic was empty. Nothing but the darkness and the weight of the silence pressing down on him. That night, the creature came closer. It was no longer just a shadow on the roof. The Mothman seemed to be everywhere. It moved through the house, its wings brushing against the walls, filling the rooms with its presence. Emily could hear it, feel it. Every time she closed her eyes, its red eyes burned through the darkness. She could hear the flap of its wings, the rustling sound of its enormous form moving through the halls. It felt as though the house itself was alive, breathing with the creature. The fear began to take root. Alice started having nightmares, waking up in the middle of the night, screaming about a dark figure watching her from the corner of her room. Ben was quieter, but Emily saw the look in his eyes. The same fear she felt, the same dread that had settled into her bones. They tried to leave, but it was too late. The Mothman wasn't just an intruder. It had claimed the house as its own, feeding off their fear, trapping them within its walls. The creature didn't want them to leave. It wanted them to stay, to live in the terror it had created. The house had never been abandoned because of the weather or the condition of the structure. It had been abandoned because of the creature that haunted it. The Mothman wasn't a visitor. It was part of the house, part of the darkness that lived within its walls. And now, it was feeding on them, growing stronger with each passing day. The Martins were trapped. They couldn't escape the house, couldn't escape the Mothman. It had already claimed them. And as the night stretched on, the family realized that they were not just haunted, They were part of a nightmare that had no end. The Mothman would never let them go, and the house would never let them leave. Story number 8. The eyes of the fallen Mark had never believed in the supernatural. He was a man of science, a man of reason. He worked as an engineer, relying on logic and facts to guide his life. But everything changed the night of the crash. It had been a typical evening, the kind where nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Mark was driving home after a late shift, his mind focused on the road ahead, the hum of his tires against the asphalt soothing in the silence. But then it happened. A sharp screech of tires, a flash of headlights, and before he could react, the crash. The world tilted, spun, and then went black. When Mark woke up, he was in a hospital bed, the sterile smell of antiseptic filling his nose. His body ached, his head throbbing with every pulse of his heartbeat. His hands were bandaged, his leg in a cast. But it wasn't the pain that haunted him. It was the memory of the crash, the sound of metal crunching, the feeling of the car tumbling, and the flash of something in the distance. It was the wings. The wings were enormous, black, stretching far into the sky like a shadow in the moonlight. But when he tried to recall the image, it faded, slipping from his mind like smoke. The doctors told him that he was lucky to be alive, that the crash was a miracle he had walked away from. But they didn't tell him about what happened after, the nightmares, the hallucinations. At first, it was just a flicker, an image at the edge of his vision, a figure, dark and massive, with wings that seemed too wide, too unnatural. He would see it standing at the edge of a field or in the trees just outside his window. Always distant, always watching. Mark thought it was just his mind playing tricks, the trauma of the accident still rattling his senses. But then it happened again, and again. The creature, no, the Mothman, appeared more often, always in the corner of his sight, always watching, waiting. He became obsessed. It wasn't just a hallucination. There had to be something more to it. There had to be a reason why this figure kept appearing, why it was so drawn to him. The Mothman, the stories, the sightings, they were real, and he needed to understand why it was coming to him. Late one night, he began searching for answers. He pored over every article, every report he could find on the Mothman. He learned about the sightings in the small town of Point Pleasant, the strange creature that had appeared before disasters, before tragedies that no one could explain. And then, as his obsession deepened, he found a disturbing connection. The site of the crash, the place where he had nearly lost his life, was only a few miles from where the Mothman had last been seen. The thought struck him like a bolt of lightning. The creature wasn't just a coincidence. It was tied to the crash, to the death he had narrowly avoided. It had been watching, waiting for something, for him. As the days passed, the sightings grew more intense. Mark began to see the Mothman everywhere, in the reflections of windows, in the polished surface of mirrors, in the dark corners of his home. Each time, it was the same, those glowing red eyes watching him, waiting. Its wings stretched out like a shadow, larger and darker than anything natural, and always the feeling of dread, of impending disaster. But it wasn't just the hallucinations. The creature spoke to him in his dreams. Each night, Mark would lie in bed, unable to move, unable to scream, while the Mothman hovered above him. Its eyes would burn into his, its wings filling the sky, casting the world into darkness. And it would whisper to him, "You are the one who can stop it." At first, Mark didn't understand, but the creature kept speaking, kept repeating the same cryptic words. It told him of a catastrophe, something terrible that was coming, a disaster so great that only he could prevent it. The Mothman wasn't just a harbinger, it was warning him, but there was a catch. The creature told him that to stop the disaster, Mark would have to make a terrible choice, a sacrifice he wasn't ready to face. The Mothman never explained exactly what that cost would be, but Mark could feel it in his bones. Something had to be given, and it would be something precious, something he couldn't bear to lose. As the visions became more frequent, Mark's grip on reality began to slip. The line between what was real and what was hallucination grew blurrier with each passing day. His friends and family grew concerned as he stopped sleeping, as he spoke about the Mothman and the warning it had given him. They thought he was losing his mind, but Mark knew. He knew that the creature was real, that it was tied to him, to the crash. He couldn't ignore it any longer. He had to act. On a cold, moonless night, Mark drove to the site of the crash, the place where the Mothman had first appeared. He stood there, the darkness surrounding him, and waited. The air was thick with something ancient, something hungry. And as he stood there, the Mothman appeared, its massive wings unfurling in the distance. Its eyes burned like twin coals, watching him. And then, the voice spoke again, louder than ever. "The choice is yours. The cost will be great, but you will stop it." Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he realized the truth. He had already made the choice. The creature had been with him from the beginning, guiding him, drawing him to this moment. The disaster was already in motion, and the only way to stop it was to let go of everything he had left. The Mothman didn't move. It didn't have to. Its eyes were all that Mark could see, and in those eyes he understood. The sacrifice wasn't just his, it was the world's. And as the wings enveloped him in darkness, Mark knew that the cost was more than he could bear. Story number 9, The Black-Winged Messenger. It was a quiet village, the kind where everyone knew each other's name, and life moved at a slow, predictable pace. But all that changed when the deaths began. At first, it was just one. A young woman found dead under strange circumstances. Then, within weeks, others followed. Men, women, even children. No one could explain it. The bodies were found in their homes, their faces frozen in expressions of terror, but no marks, no obvious cause of death. It was as if their very souls had been stolen, leaving behind only empty shells. The village had always been a place of peace, tucked away in the hills, far from the noise of the city. But the deaths brought something darker. The whispers started, quiet at first, rumors that spread like wildfire. The Mothman had been seen in the skies above, its massive wings casting long shadows over the village. The creature, with its glowing red eyes and dark wings, was said to be a harbinger of doom, a messenger that came before disaster. To most, it was just another myth, a story passed down through generations. But for Daniel, a grieving father who had lost his daughter, Emily, to the strange deaths, it was no longer just a story. He couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was somehow tied to the deaths, that it was more than just a legend. Daniel had watched his daughter's body being carried away, her face as pale as the moon, her eyes wide open, staring at something only she could see. He had stood in the corner of the room during the funeral, numb with shock, but beneath that shock was a gnawing suspicion. His daughter had seen something, the Mothman. It was the only explanation that made sense to him. Determined to uncover the truth, Daniel began his own investigation. He didn't care that people whispered behind his back or told him to let it go. He couldn't. Not until he understood why his daughter had died, and why the others had followed. The more he searched, the more he uncovered. The Mothman had been seen for centuries, always appearing before disasters struck. Some said it was a warning, others said it was a curse. But one thing was clear: it was tied to death, and no one who saw it ever escaped unscathed. Daniel began to find records of its appearances, stories of villagers in nearby towns who had seen the creature in the skies just before a calamity struck. Fires, floods, earthquakes. People had seen the Mothman, and then, days or weeks later, the disaster would hit. But it wasn't just the Mothman that brought death. It was the message it carried, a warning of something inevitable, something that no one could stop. As Daniel dug deeper, he found an old journal buried in the back of the town's library. The journal belonged to a priest who had lived in the village over 100 years ago. The priest wrote about the Mothman, about how it had appeared before every great disaster in the village's history. The journal spoke of an ancient curse, one that had been placed on the land long before the village was founded. The curse was tied to the skies, to the wings of a creature that was neither alive nor dead. It was a messenger, sent to warn the living of the death that was coming. The journal described a ritual, a way to appease the Mothman, to stop it from bringing destruction. But the ritual was lost to time. No one knew how to perform it, and even if they did, it was believed that the creature was unstoppable, that its message could not be denied. The more Daniel learned, the more he realized that the creature wasn't just a myth, it was real, and it wasn't here to save anyone. It was a harbinger, a symbol of death that came when the balance had been tipped. The Mothman didn't cause disaster. It was the warning that something worse was on the way, something that no one could stop. One evening, as Daniel stood on the edge of the village, looking out at the darkening sky, he saw it. The Mothman. It hovered above the trees, its wings unfurled like a black shroud, blocking out the stars. Its eyes burned red, looking down at him with an intelligence that seemed to pierce through him. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The wind held its breath. Daniel's heart raced as the creature descended, its wings beating slowly, like a drum of doom. The message was clear. There would be no escape. The curse was already in motion, and death was coming. The Mothman lingered for a moment longer, its wings casting long shadows over the village, before it turned and disappeared into the night. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that the creature wasn't just a messenger. It was the embodiment of something ancient, something inevitable. No one could stop it. No one could outrun it. The deaths had only been the beginning, and the Mothman would continue to appear as long as the curse lingered. No one would be safe. No one would be spared. Daniel turned and walked back to his home, knowing that nothing he did could change what was coming. The Mothman had shown him the truth. Death was inevitable, and the creature was the only warning they would get. No one could escape the eyes of the fallen. Story number 10. The Mothman's Call. The small town of Black Hollow had been shrouded in mystery for decades. Stories of the Mothman had spread like wildfire, ever since the first reports of its haunting presence years ago. Some claimed it was a harbinger of doom, while others said it was a creature from another world entirely. Whatever it was, its eerie appearances had captured the attention of paranormal investigators from all over the country. So, when the team from the Paranormal Research Society arrived in Black Hollow, they did so with a sense of purpose, ready to uncover the truth behind the sightings. There was no doubt in their minds that something unnatural was lurking in the town's shadowy corners, and they were determined to find it. The team consisted of 4 members: Emily, the lead investigator, who had a reputation for handling the most dangerous cases; Mark, a skeptic who questioned everything, even the existence of the supernatural; Lisa, an empath who could sense energy in places where something was disturbed; and Jake, the tech specialist, who brought the equipment to capture evidence of the paranormal. They arrived at dusk. the sky blood red as the sun dipped below the horizon. The town of Black Hollow was quiet, almost too quiet. Its streets were narrow, its buildings old and decaying. There was a sense of unease in the air, like the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The Mothman, the creature they had come to investigate, was said to haunt these woods, lurking in the sky above, its massive wings casting long shadows over the town. As the team set up their equipment near the edge of the forest, they began to feel the weight of the silence pressing down on them. The sound of their footsteps on the dry leaves seemed louder than it should have been. Jake adjusted the camera equipment, his voice tight with excitement. "We're ready. Let's get some footage. If the Mothman shows up, we'll catch it." Emily nodded, scanning the woods with a sharp eye. "Stay alert. Whatever happens tonight, we need to keep our wits about us." Mark gave a half-hearted chuckle. "You mean you need to keep your wits? I'm still not convinced there's anything out there." But as the words left his mouth, the first strange thing happened. The temperature dropped sharply, as if a cold wind had swept through the area. Lisa shivered, her hand instinctively clutching her pendant. It's here. I can feel it." Jake's camera suddenly flickered, its display jumping from normal to static, then back again, the image briefly distorting into a strange, black shape with glowing red eyes. He cursed and tried to adjust the settings, but the static only worsened. "It's playing with us," Emily said, her voice steady but her eyes narrowing. She could sense it too, the creeping tension in the air, the feeling that something was moving just beyond the reach of their senses. As they ventured further into the forest, the sky darkened, and the trees loomed over them like silent sentinels. Mark's flashlight flickered intermittently, and his skepticism began to fade. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. Suddenly, Lisa stopped. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her face pale as a sheet. They all listened. At first, there was nothing but the rustling of the leaves in the wind. Then, a distant, high-pitched screech broke the silence, a sound like wings cutting through the air. It was followed by a low, deep rumble, like thunder rolling in the distance. The ground trembled beneath their feet. "It's here," Emily muttered under her breath, her heart racing. "We need to find it." But as they continued deeper into the forest, the air grew heavier, more oppressive. The trees seemed to close in around them, blocking out the faint moonlight. The night was alive with the sound of something moving, circling above them, and the team felt as if they were being hunted. Then it appeared. The Mothman. It was enormous, towering above them, its black wings spread wide, blocking out the sky. Its eyes, glowing red like embers, locked onto theirs, and they felt an icy chill wash over them. It didn't move, just watched them, waiting. Emily took a step forward, her hand reaching for her equipment, but she couldn't bring herself to look away from the creature. It was as if the Mothman's eyes were pulling her in, drawing her closer. And then, without warning, the visions began. At first, it was just fleeting. Shadows flickering in the corner of her vision, faces from the past, memories long forgotten. But they grew clearer. She saw her own reflection, distorted, warped, as if the world itself was unraveling. The Mothman's wings flapped, and the world around her began to twist, warping into shapes and figures that didn't belong. The ground beneath her feet began to shake, and she could hear distant screams, the cries of the people who had fallen victim to the creature before them. "Emily, snap out of it!" Mark's voice broke through the haze, but she couldn't move, couldn't respond. The creature's gaze held her in place. Jake stumbled backward, his eyes wild as he looked up at the sky. "It's controlling us," he shouted. The creature, it's feeding on our fear." Lisa collapsed to her knees, her breathing shallow. "It's in my head," she gasped. "It's showing me things that haven't happened yet, but I know they will." The Mothman's wings beat again, louder this time, and as it did, the forest seemed to distort, bending and warping around them. The shadows grew longer, more oppressive, until it felt as though the entire world was closing in on them. The creature didn't move, but the air grew thick with a pressure they couldn't explain. The Mothman's call, the screech that echoed through the trees, was no longer just a sound. It was a voice, a whisper in their minds, telling them of the disaster that was coming. A warning, but one that held no hope. "You can't escape it," the creature's voice whispered, and Emily felt the cold fingers of inevitability clutch her heart. The team realized, with a sickening certainty, that the Mothman wasn't just a creature from the shadows. It was a force, a thing that existed outside of human comprehension, manipulating their every thought, every move. It wasn't here to simply frighten them. It was here to draw them toward a fate they could never avoid. In the distance, the sound of an approaching storm mixed with the creature's call, and the world around them seemed to collapse into darkness. The Mothman had chosen them, and there would be no escape from its gaze.